Procedural generation is ruining gaming.
An entire universe generated by the computer.
Just how big is this game?
Biggest one yet. It is 4 times the size of Fallout 4.
Over 1,000 planets.
It allows us to have 16 times the detail.
18 quintillion planets.
Sometimes it doesn't just work.
To discover what's out there.
You serious?
Who's laughing now?
Yup, it's true. Your favorite game's gonna be ruined tomorrow. Say goodbye. It was a good life, but thank you, Cyberpunk, for letting me customize my wee-wee. No, in all seriousness, let's talk about procedural generation and its effect on the gaming market in very recent times. Most of the time, this technology is used to help developers meet deadlines and create vast worlds to then sculpt with the finer details. Other times, we get games like No Man's Sky 1.0 or Starfield, everyone's favorite new RPG, right guys? Right. Chances are, it's only going to get worse, dear viewer. By golly, I can sense some big stinkers on the horizon. For the most part, we've seen solid releases over this last year, but occasionally we get one game that is hyped beyond belief, only to emerge from the water as a real disappointment. AAA gaming manages to stray ever so slightly from the companies we grew up on and love to money-hungry tyrants trying to push an agenda. How can we sell our players a game with very little original and innovative content for the least amount of effort? Well, the answer is tied to procedural generation. Originally being used to assist development, I think it might just be getting abused to replace proper effort and care. I'm sure many of you, like me, are tired of feeling as if the content in our games is so mundane and repetitive. Remember back in the days of old, where you'd sit on your couch during Christmas break, playing on your new console, and cranking out a ton of hours in a new or favorite game of yours? Me too. For me, those games were Skyrim and Black Ops 2 with the boys, sinking at least 1,000 hours playing different characters and variations of builds in Skyrim, and also queuing up for multiplayer search and destroy, or some good old League play with the gang trying to improve our rank from bronze to silver. Time in and time out, your favorite games were built upon the brilliant and creative minds in the industry.
I'm not kidding.
Todd Howard changed Bethesda's legacy from a future of sports games to the titan that produces Elder Scrolls and Fallout, household gaming names for years to come. Blizzard eclipsed the MMO genre by straying from their roots in strategy games to make World of Warcraft, a product they holistically believed in and went all in on. MiHoYo or HoYoverse went from making Honkai Impact 3rd to pouring all their energy and funding into the creation of Genshin Impact. Regardless of the quality, you will always have people talking about the new stuff these companies cook up. Love them or hate them, these are names you can't ignore, whether it's a future title they make now or a big update. Even people that don't currently play their games react to the content with some level of interest. The thing is, what makes all these games special? What can make these products so loved compared to the other games and create a cult-like following? Well, the answer is simple. It's knowing the type of game you want to make, along with the creative genius combined with handcrafted content for players to enjoy and play in their own way. You may associate linearity as a negative when crafting successful games, but what if we took a step back in time and examined a handcrafted approach versus procedural generation? You might be asking, Mr. YouTuber sir, what does procedurally generated content mean? Good question. The wordy definition would be a method to create data algorithmically as opposed to manually, created by computers over a human. Procedural generation isn't newfound technology. In fact, it's actually been used since the late 1970s in text-based games such as Beneath Apple Manor in 1978 and Rogue, the game responsible for all the roguelikes we see today, such as Hades or Risk of Rain 2. In layman's terms, this would be present in things such as Oblivion's open world and the Iliad Ruins, or dungeons for those that haven't played it. What this does is allow the developer to create a large amount of space to work with quickly without worrying about, okay, we need to put this tree here, pile of rubble there, and a chest there. After this, Bethesda then improves upon the procedural generation by handcrafting the layouts of towns or specific areas in the world that they want you to explore, turning them into what we call points of interest as determined by waypoints or markers on maps in modern gaming. Examples of procedural generation being an astounding success is present in everybody's favorite ARPG, Diablo, or Diablo 2 to be precise. The areas in that game are generated randomly. They will be similar to the last time you've been there, but with a different layout due to the RNG nature of procedural generation, keeping not only the itemization fresh from random drops, but also the locales you visit so an area wouldn't get old as it would in something like Diablo 4, where the open world is an unchanging static layout. The problem isn't when developers use it to shorten development time or to help add foliage and the like to areas they create, but rather when it becomes the focal point of the content or a big portion of it. Some of you may have heard of a little game that dropped recently known as Starfield. Now Bethesda fanboys, before you hold your pitchforks in anger and tell me, oh I don't know what I'm talking about, bear with me for a second. What was the focal point of Bethesda's marketing for Starfield? It was a grand adventure into the unknown we call space. I'll just let this little clip play out for you.
You may be wondering, just how big is this game? So we thought we'd take one last moment and show you. Let's take a look at one of our planets, Jemison. You can land in New Atlantis, but you can also land and explore anywhere on the planet. And it's not just this planet, it's all the planets in the system. From barren but resource-heavy ice balls to Goldilocks planets with life. And not just this system, but over 100 systems. Over 1,000 planets, all open for you to explore. We can't wait to see what you find.
Abandoning their approach of handcrafting areas after the fact, and instead advertising the barren, lifeless planets as the content and places you will be experiencing, I don't know about you, but that hardly sounds like fun to me. And it wasn't from what I played. There were other aspects of the game that were average, but the exploration took a deep plunge and is just non-existent in the current version of Starfield. I uploaded another video discussing my concerns with Starfield and overall thoughts of the game, where some people weren't happy with my take or felt as if the game is fine, as is, because this leaves room for modders to take their own planets and create endless amounts of content instead of Bethesda putting in the work themselves. If you're a Steam user, this probably doesn't bother you, as you'll be installing free mods created and uploaded to the Nexus Mods workshop, and not have to engage with systems like the Creation Club. For the rest, and I'd argue the majority of the player base, considering this was an Xbox and day one Game Pass release, are just going to either result into buying paid content expansions out of the Creation Club or waiting down the line to see if Bethesda has any solutions coming with their first DLC. This is a game Todd Howard wants to be played for years to come, but instead of giving you the carrot on a stick to chase or the content up front, he made a nice base for a game that people will add to and make it replayable, all free of charge on Bethesda and Microsoft's end. I'll probably be debated on the premise that this is just how Bethesda games are, a modder's paradise and a place for the community to go wild with designing stuff. While this is fun and exciting to see what modders will develop once the creation kit drops next year, their other games are not lacking in terms of content to do, but also exploration for you to engage in.
Fun begins.
You could boot up any Elder Scrolls or Fallout game besides 76 and spend your time wandering the landscapes, getting lost into things the team had designed themselves. The music, quests, and the atmosphere are completely different. These are things you just won't find in Starfield, as it being an expanded universe compared to an open world map has the game lose all cohesion and sense of scale, as the only things you will be seeing and comparing the planet to you're on are similar layouts found in all others all over the universe. The best part is that none of this is even static, it's all procedurally generated, so get excited to be seeing the same Crimson Fleet base in 5 different locations, and wonder how they pulled off the technology used in Dracula's castle to move it. Static layouts aren't always a negative either, depending on the type of game you're creating. Take Dark Souls as an example. There is zero procedural generation in the level layouts, and the item locations are the same each time, allowing for player knowledge to come into play on returning playthroughs or once you've been through an area a few times, giving you satisfaction for big braining the game. In a game such as Dark Souls, this works to its advantage, allowing the player to ground themselves in the world and remember the locations with memories. Handcrafting games has been extremely popular with Zelda as well. Older titles pre-Breath of the Wild have favored an approach of a set path through the game and deciding when you'll be able to access certain areas or a personalized puzzle and quest from the developers themselves. Metroidvanias will tease you with this location you are so close to reaching but can't quite make it until you get a power up from exploring. The reason why static layouts are unfavorable to games such as Diablo 4 is because not only do you not interact with the open world after farming renown, the most optimal way to do anything was to spam the same dungeons over and over upon release, thus resulting in a very monotonous playing experience for people following metas. I'm sure this wasn't the intended design, but it was the result of a lack of playtesting from developers or a mindset of thinking how, as a player, naturally, you will experiment if the game allows it and try to find the optimal way to do things.
Fix your game!
For example, take a look at Skyrim. The open world and dungeons were procedurally generated at first, but then they were handcrafted. The dungeons into linear hallways followed by big rooms, and no real open-ended branching paths for the base game. The world is then filled with towns, caves, monuments, and barrows. It's not necessarily a bad thing when games are developed with linearity, as this avoids player confusion and allows the developer to streamline the experience they want to give, but the approach of procedural generation versus handcrafted content differs from game to game. The biggest thing a developer should approach this concept from is, what is your target audience? Who are you making this game for? How do they play similar games in the market? How do you want your project to be experienced? For Starfield and other games of its nature, it's like trying to advertise an all-you-can-eat buffet, but only the ribs weren't undercooked. Very similar to advertising in general, or even content creation. Eventually you need to figure out what sort of audience you want to attract and how you want to design your project. Without this know-how and ample testing of said product, how are you going to know whether it works or not? Maybe it'll generate zero interest, or it could be the next blockbuster hit. After all, goals without a plan are just wishes. Okay, we've talked about procedural generation, but what about handcrafted content? What's a great example of a game that is a massive success upon being a handcrafted experience? How many of you are fans of The Last of Us, Dark Souls, or even another small game known as Elden Ring? I'm sure many of you have fond stories of each of these games and can recall the experiences you've had while first playing them, whether it was to fellow internet strangers or the people you're close with in person. What is it that truly sets these titles apart from something in a similar genre but with procedural generation? Well, for starters, it's the intent of the developers. Sony games have received the title of interactive movies, which has worked out in their favor, and I'd agree with this in an endearing way. When you're playing through The Last of Us, it's not just another video game you picked up at the bargain bin for $10 and a few hours of fun. No, it's a world with characters that touch your heartstrings for the 15 or so hours it takes to play the game. Whether your favorite moment is seeing the giraffes, or the plot involving Sam and Henry, it manages to pull you out of the "this is just another game" and transports you to the zombie apocalyptic locale of the United States, adding stakes and tension to the story through the characters developed to intentionally draw you in and care for them. Elden Ring is an entirely handcrafted open world aside from maybe where the foliage itself was placed. Each dungeon, cliff, sculpture, jutted rock sticking out of the crystalline woods in Liurnia, the harrowing scorched sky of Caelid, enemy placements, weapon locales, armor sets. The same can be said for Dark Souls, as this has been From Software's approach for years and will hopefully be for years to come. A major player in why their games are constantly in the limelight, constantly being discussed by YouTubers, fans, and journalists alike. These are games that have had a massive impact on what kind of content goes for an RPG and how to engage a player into the world to get invested into. Present by the amount of Souls-likes developers have tried to make, or people dipping their toes into the subgenre of gaming. But why does this content have such a massive impact and hold so much of the attention of your average gamer? Well, the simplest answer would be these are just good games, but why is the game good is a question I'm sure every developer wishes they had the answer to, so they can make the next iteration of best-selling games. You can attribute From Software's success over the years to getting multiple things right. Lore, combat, world building, music, and you'd be right. But there are plenty of Souls-likes that have tried to copy their formula, but things such as the interconnected levels, locations, familiarity through landmarks are things that you have to get right to achieve a similar level of success in this space. It's not just as easy as placing a bonfire on the immediate path, it takes a lot more than that. In fact, the only game I'd argue that has even gotten close to From Software's level of world building and a sense of self and environments is probably Lies of P. Neo, while being a Souls-like, roots its gameplay into more mission-based structures to drop in and drop out of, and that's what they've done for their formula, and that works too. It's not a cohesive open world, but there are plenty of avenues to replicate this concept. It's just not something that every developer has managed. In the current day and age, better technology and a large amount of funding alone simply can't beat the creative mind of a human or a competent development team, I'd argue. And it's not been able to triumph the need for developers and ambition. After all, ambition is ambiguous and can be attributed to many different factors in a team and an individual's life. Elden Ring sold 20 million copies since its release last February in 2022, almost reaching 1 million players on Steam alone, with 952,523 concurrent players at one time. Baldur's Gate 3 sold 5.3 million copies a few weeks after release, reaching 875,343 players on Steam alone. Handcrafted games that have a ton of quality and quantity, and they didn't even need a Game Pass to reach heights like these. I'd argue that if there wasn't a Game Pass for a game like Starfield, it would have received a lot more flack than just being bipolar on release. It's very easy to try a game out for $15 and be more accepting of its flaws than the people who probably paid $70 and were expecting a complete package in an RPG and fun exploration, but that's just not what you get with the game. You could argue that Microsoft isn't really trying to push sales specifically, as that's the reason for the Game Pass, which I'd agree with. Naturally, they're pushing a subscription-based service over individual sales. Also present in the fact that they'll tell you the amount of people that played Starfield over individual sales numbers. Handcrafted success isn't just a AAA thing though. Indie roguelikes are prime examples of this concept. While these games rely on procedural generation to entice a player into what feels like an eternal gameplay loop, they still have their roots in handcrafted content. Take a look at Supergiant Games' top seller in Hades, a game built around you escaping from the underworld through randomly generated rooms and enemies, keeping things fresh by altering what boons you'll acquire each run, forcing the player to adapt to the RNG and find a solution to their problem and escape. While the rooms and enemies are relatively static, and certain rooms will typically have one or two of the same enemy types recurring in playthroughs, the game generates which rooms you'll have on each run differently to keep it fresh. Without getting too wrapped up into how special of a game Hades is, and how it pulled players into its world, the game would not have had anywhere near the levels of success it did without giving you things to get attached to. Selling 1 million copies a little under only 2 years of release, with 700,000 of those sales happening during its early access period, without some level of care being put into the product. The music, storylines, characters, voice acting, interior design, mob design, placement of objects, how the RNG flows from level to level, giving the player agency over this random nature to influence the success of their runs. There are so many tiny details that go into what can make a game good, but procedural generation alone is not enough to sell you on a game. Giving players content for the sake of content but with no reason to rope them in other than something to play is going to alienate most of the audience that loves your games. Take Fallout 76 as an example. Remember when they wanted us, the players, to be the story and create the content there? While this can work for some of these games, none of them are as successful as you may think. You have people chasing the next best story, killer soundtracks, gripping gameplay, and the most important X factor of them all is uniqueness. When you take a look at a Souls title or a Souls-like, it's very apparent to tell what it is. The HUDs are all relatively similar, the gameplay heavily inspired by the original titles, but the one thing you, as somebody looking at the product, can tell is, yeah, this is Dark Souls. An iconic nature that can't be traced to the roots of a randomly generated number. Anybody can have a computer generate an image of a cool looking knight or amazing landscape, but not everybody can turn that image into a story to grip the player and get them hooked. It's a good tool, but a tool at that. Not a substitute for original ideas and sculpted content. Procedural generation is always going to be a talking point, and it definitely has its place in most, if not all, games in the future, as the scope of them increases but the development time calls for a faster production of content due to changing trends and markets. But without the fundamentals of a good design philosophy and brilliant minds behind the project, you end up with very disappointing entries into gaming with games like Starfield. Starfield, as branded by the marketing team, is supposed to be an action, role-playing adventure game with open-ended zones on 1,000 planets for you to explore. The game does accomplish this in the literal sense, as it fills all the criteria for us as the consumer to identify with the title with those labels. But it struggles to find its identity in an amalgamation of systems that are not necessarily all cohesive and add to the overall experience. Namely, the procedural generation used to create the multitude of same-looking NPCs, generic planets without features to identify them with by name, or to give the player a sense of familiarity as you come to grips with the game. It completely fails at hooking you into its universe, as you can never ground yourself in a location with landmarks, characters, soundtracks, or atmosphere as a previous title of Bethesda's has. Who remembers listening to Secunda and then you just stand on a cliff, looking around you and pondering life? You know, like, compare it to the Kingdom of Lordran or just any location in a Souls game, you know where you are, that the game is like memorable, you remember the locations. You know, I was watching my little brother struggle through Martyr Ligarius recently when he was playing Bloodborne for the first time, and Castle Canehurst is just so iconic of a location that I would know it from a screenshot. And I love that feeling of knowing where I've been in a game and having those experiences to remember, because that's what we all love about this shit. It's fun. It's just fun for you to remember the times you had, whether that was with friends or alone, and just things you experienced and you can recount to other people. It's a way for you to go out and have an adventure, you know, without having to go out and do it, because sometimes you just can't, or you don't have the funding to go on a trip somewhere else. You know, Starfield does have like exploration. It's not that the exploration is not there, but the thing is like, what am I going out to see? What is the point? The trailer, the first ever trailer of the game, literally has Sarah Morgan telling you, oh, what's out there? Well, like, nothing is out there, because when you go out to any of these planets, you don't see anything new. There is backstory on some of them that you can find through scanning the terrain, and it tells you why the planet is like that, but it's just so minimalistic, and it's not really showing you. It has to tell you, because you have to read about it. You have to engage with the scanning system. It's never anything you can see that's iconic, and you'll be like, whoa. Man, that's crazy. Like, the temples in the game could have been so much more and such an iconic part of like maybe each of those planets, because if the game had, you know, let's say another civilization, or the story around the temples themselves was better, oh shit, well, this was like a previous kingdom that aliens were on or something, you know? But there's none of that there in the game. The game doesn't have anything like that for you to just personally get immersed in or be happy about. Like in Skyrim, for example, you know, an Elder Scrolls title, one of the things you would get from going into a crypt and finding a dragon priest is you would realize, okay, this was a place that was around during ancient civilization, and this was an important part of dragon history. But there's nothing like that for you in Starfield. They have tour guides, and you can go there and learn a little bit about the world and some of the lore. But again, it's telling you, not showing you. And showing is so important in these types of games. You can't get immersed into an open world if there's nothing iconic for you to see, or something, you know, that you build that you can get attached to, because it just doesn't matter. This isn't meant as a shit on Starfield video or fuck Starfield and Bethesda, like, it's not about that, but they're the most recent example of procedural generation being used in such an egregious way that I have to comment on it. Because, you know, before this, they were using it, but they weren't using it to alleviate the need for actual content. It just feels like the world itself is being scoped around this scale instead of actual quality. Oh yeah, let's put 1,000 planets in here. Fine, put 1,000 planets in there, but what is the point for these 1,000 planets to exist? Having them barren just because, oh, well, it's realistic, there would be barren planets in space. That's great that there would be barren planets in space, but this is a video game, man. I want to go somewhere on the far corners of the galaxy, and I want to see something that I've never seen before, something I won't be able to see in my own personal life. That's what games are about, especially if you're building some sort of fantasy game, whether that's sci-fi or medieval. It's just, you can't just do this thing where you'll be like, well, I mean, that's content. Because it's not. There is no content out there. There could be, maybe in the future, you know, someone's gonna mod in like the content that you didn't put in yourself, or you're gonna add it in DLCs down the line. But it makes repetitive exploration much more egregious than it's ever been with something such as a Radiant Quest in Skyrim or something else, because those systems aren't something you need to engage with to enjoy the open world or enjoy roaming around. Because there's so much more. In this game, because not everything is tied to a planet, you have to go through space to the planet, around, and keep going. You constantly see the same vistas over and over. There is no difference between me going to Todd Howard Landia and Bobby Kotick Land, you know? No Man's Sky upon release was the same thing, almost an endless universe to explore with different planets and systems to get into, but the game itself was extremely bare bones and was not what the hype or marketing would have you expect it to play. Even making an appearance on live television because of how insane the hype was. You can argue that, oh, but Mr. YouTuber, Starfield wasn't about the exploration, it's a BGS title. It's about the characters and the stories. I don't know what BGS games you played, but exploration has always been at the forefront, giving you locations and interesting places to want to get invested in. Danger quests, shrines, dynamic encounters, like an assassin trying to kill you or a thief robbing you off the highway in the open world. All things that add to your experience and enhance the world created to make it feel alive. Maybe that's not believable to you enough. How about when Todd Howard said, you can walk all the way to the top of that mountain? How about when Fallout 76 was 4 times the size of Fallout 4? or during Starfield's official gameplay reveal when Todd asks us the rhetorical question of just how big this universe is. You can explore not just this planet, but all of them in this system. There are hundreds of systems and 1,000 planets. Exploration is absolutely at the forefront and focus for them as a studio, but this route of bigger and more quantity was just not better. 10 planets unique in nature, full of quality content, would have been much more of an interesting experience, with different locales, biomes, exclusive soundtracks, cultures unique to each planet, unique wildlife with purpose in the ecosystem. More than 1,000 planets with mostly the same activities to engage in could ever be. Procedural generation isn't all bad though when it's done right. This has been proven to work in titles such as Minecraft years before Starfield was in the works, but Minecraft grounds the player in other ways. Talking about specifically the survival mode, the game roots you in that concept alone, survive. Okay, but why is survive so different from explore as the sole reason for things to exist? It's because the concept of survival forces you to engage with everything in your surroundings to, in turn, survive. Getting hungry? You better kill a pig or a cow for some sustenance. Sometimes they run away from you when you're trying to fist them to death. Well, it's time to craft a weapon and some better gear to optimize hunting and gathering. Tools breaking too often and you want things to last? Let's get mining, boys. Sure, you can get by with wooden or stone tools and just enjoy a day-to-day life living in your square home. I'm guilty of doing this myself, but humans are nothing if not ambitious. Slowly, you get used to your environment. You determine what nearby locations are worth exploring, where to gather the materials you need, whether that's food or wood. You have to go out into the open world and harvest nearby locations. Eventually, some of those resources around you are just going to dry up, thus requiring you to make further and further trips into the procedurally generated world to continue progressing. The beauty of a system like this is that while it is structured around a procedurally generated area, once it's created, the location is there. It's not gonna move. It's not changing anytime soon unless you decide to build structures or personally take to reforming the landscape. This allows the player to feel a sense of structure and a sense of self over time. While the world starts off random and unfamiliar, you get slowly accustomed to it over time and you can come to grips with the world as it slowly becomes your home and the place you know. Valheim, another sandbox game that does procedural generation well. You're not thinking about it because it's not the selling point of the title. The selling point of Valheim is an open world survival sandbox game. Instead of grounding yourself through systems like hunger or imminent death, the game has you follow a set of tutorials at the start to come to terms with the game, and it's how you're going to progress. The kicker is that if you want to progress, you have to engage with the campaign. What does the campaign consist of though? Well, let's take the starting experience of Valheim. You can craft stone tools and cut down certain trees and mine more stone, but you'll never be able to chop birch trees or mine copper, craft better armor if you never kill the deer. If you don't kill the deer, no antler pickaxe, no copper, no tree boss. You can do them out of order for sure, but you'll have a tougher time surviving enemy attacks and different landscapes such as the snowy mountains if you haven't gathered the resources from the previous intended area for you to be in. You could argue this is linear and boring, but in practice, you don't even think about this. Instead, it just keeps the gameplay loop refreshing and addictive as you have all this area to explore in the plains, the Black Forest, swamp, snowy mountains, and just when you feel like you might be getting bored, boom! You beat a new boss and unlocked a whole new tier of gear to experiment, craft, and build with, thus constantly refreshing the gameplay loop with new content. Procedural generation adds to the game world in the same way as Minecraft. It gives you an ever-expanding landscape to mess around with, but it's not exploration for exploration's sake. It puts you on its own treadmill ever so sneakily and gets the player to interact with the world that way and immerse themselves in it. These games know what they want to be, and they don't have to deal with things such as feature creep. They stuck to their ideal and found success in that. The game rewards you through the progression of personal knowledge, and humans, without thinking about it, are curious creatures that love to learn. Whether it's new gameplay systems, new sites, exploits, or creative fixes to problems, we love to learn, and any game that embraces this retains much more players and has such a higher satisfaction curve compared to one that is purely at the hands of RNG and changes upon re-entry consistently. After all, sharing your findings as a community when these massive open worlds are created is a big part of the fun for a lot of people, including me. Remember when people discovered the Dragon Slayer and K-Lid? It's something you just can't replicate as well in a game that uses random generation for its content, like Starfield, because nothing in the game is going to be the same from one playthrough to the other, aside from I guess the quests, but the quests are subjective. A moment everybody can remember as the moment of that game, that's what you need to have in your game for it to become iconic. Skyrim has...
Hey, you. Finally awake.
What in oblivion is that?
Centuries
What do you see?
It's in the clouds!
And then there's Oblivion.
You sleep rather soundly for a murderer. That's good.
How about the first time you fought Ornstein and Smo? Games are defined by these special moments that we can share and enjoy as a community. As I was talking about earlier, it definitely has its place in things such as ARPGs to keep things fresh, and I do think it's a great thing for developers to be able to save time where possible, but relying on it to drive a person's immersion and excitement to be in your world is just not the answer. In Diablo, it's not the randomly generated environments that causes you to explore, it's the loot. It's seeing your character progress, get stronger, bigger number, better person. And the list goes on, giving you a carrot on the stick to chase in an extremely satisfying loop. Again, not straying from its roots in Diablo 1, but rather expanding upon the original concepts to create a bigger and better game in the sequel. Those are examples of procedural generation used well by a developer to enhance our experiences as players over taking a linear approach and trying to handcraft each area. While the sights can be exciting to see for the first time, and I thoroughly enjoyed going through the different zones in Diablo 4, something such as procedural generation could be used to enhance the dungeon department with constraints. I do know there is a little bit of that in the game, but the areas still feel so samey that you don't really notice it, and you might have thought that the dungeons themselves were static the first few times you've gone through them. Procedural generation feels as if it's the little man on your shoulder telling you to take the easy way out, or the devil's lettuce of gaming, as my father would put it. It has good uses in moderation, but like anything in life, temptation leads to indulgence, and too much indulgence isn't a good thing. You might be asking, where do linear styled games find their success then? Well, funnily enough, a great example of this is Call of Duty, back in the day and now. In the multiplayer, you're given an objective and a list of maps that you can play at random in a playlist of your choosing. The maps themselves are static, with designated choke points designed to funnel us players to them to interact with there. And then you have shootouts, but the variance in a game like this isn't necessarily in how you're going to flank the opponent. There are multiple routes to go through, but it's more so through the player interactions and confining us in tight spaces where you'll have to run into somebody sooner than later. Mega Man has a somewhat similar approach in the sense of there's one path to go through each level. At the end of each level there's a boss. You fight the boss, rinse and repeat till you get to the final stage, then there's a boss rush, then the final boss. Bethesda tried their hand at player interactions at the heart of the approach with Fallout 76, but aside from 16 times the bugs, the world didn't have the substance to engage us or have us socializing with one another compared to that of an MMO or an extraction shooter like Tarkov, where running into players is inevitable and at the heart of the game's design. Look at games from Ubisoft. Time in and time out, they create these massively beautiful open worlds filled with amazing details, but what's at the heart of the open world content? It's not unique stuff per game or unique activities that you won't find in something else in the genre. It's procedurally generated checklists. They could be doing so much more to get you invested into their game, such as dynamic quests or different content per region. Anybody else remember getting the armor of Brutus in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood? Well, since they sell well enough, enjoy clearing 1 out of 15 forts, buddy. It's okay to have repeatable content in your game, but you should be mixing it up each area instead of making it something very, very similar compared to what a player just experienced. Otherwise, your brain just shuts off when you do these activities, and then it just feels like, well, what am I doing? This is something AI is going to eventually be able to ship out to you and just give you in loads of games anyways. So, as a consumer, you'll have your fill at some point. Any form of content, whether it's a silly video like this, article, interview, movie, show, even gaming, it's just going to perform so much better if you put your all on the line and try to innovate, make improvements where you can, not ship out the same thing customers have already experienced. There's a reason why following trends helps, but at the end of the day, it's not going to put you in the spotlight. You have to come up with these ideas or innovations that your genre hasn't even thought of yet and blow people out the water with it, which I'm sure is exactly what the creators of Rogue themselves were thinking when they designed their unique spin on gaming that propelled a whole subgenre. Procedural generation has been around since the late 1900s, seeing use in even written games such as Beneath Apple Manor for the Apple II, developed by Don Worth and released in 1978, a game that predates even the originator of the name roguelike in this genre. A game named Rogue that was released in 1980 for Unix-based machines, developed by 4 guys, Michael Toy, Glenn Wichman, Ken Arnold, and John Lane. Rogue was developed to combat the rules established by existing word-based games at the time that Michael and Glenn played. They wanted a game where each experience will feel fresh to the player and have them find ways to solve problems presented to them that they may not necessarily be prepared for. This game uses the RNG aspect of procedural generation to spice up your playthrough, not take away from it or replace the effort needed for them to create a unique experience. The goal of the game was to reach the lowest floor, retrieve the amulet of Yondor, and escape with it. Each playthrough was different, as are you going to see an orc on floor 9 or a centaur? Being inspired by text-based adventures such as Colossal Cave Adventure and the likes of Dungeons & Dragons, their goal was to keep you on your toes, and after a while, Rogue started being shipped on the Unix operating system itself, leading for a craze and a way for people to get their hands on it around the world. Procedural generation serves as a double-edged sword. Over time though, this seems to be the future for AAA gaming and just where it's going to end up. Games are oftentimes advertised through quantity over quality. Case in point, 1,000 piles of shit for you to trudge through if that's your thing without much variance, or 18 quintillion explorable planets. Funny how it's the space games pushing this concept only so far. Starfield wasn't made by the Bethesda many of us know and love. It's a product of modern gaming adhering to a standard of massive amount of areas to roam in, as these are some of the highest selling games every year, and attract investors and shareholders. After all, Microsoft didn't purchase them for $7.5 billion just so they can make a cute little game like Fallout Shelter. Thus pushing the agenda of scale is better over scope of the singular project and the ideals it tries to push and identify with. If you truly love Starfield, what's your favorite location in the entire game and why? I guarantee most people, not arguing for the sake of argument, would say that it's one of the handcrafted cities or outposts with either a favorite character or landmarks that are grand and beautiful for them to remember. Is there a single star system that stands out compared to the rest? No, I don't think so, because each planet is changed upon re-entry. It's just a refresh on the land with the same 5 or 6 POIs for you to see. It's not dynamic, and there's not enough randomness to keep it fresh. These games used procedural generation to give you a bunch of random fluff content with no substance. Remember Radiant quests in Skyrim for the different factions after you've beaten their campaigns? Yeah, all they did was add Radiant areas to those Radiant quests now. So instead of being able to immerse yourself or familiarize yourself with different planets, you go to the objective, complete the mission, rinse and repeat like a robot. There was no thought or care put into this addition to the game. They completely threw exploration out the window for a sense of scale that isn't even present, mind you, because you can't be on every 1,000 planet at once, nor can you explore the entirety of a planet when you're there. It's not like you'd want to do this anyway, as it's the same shit, different color rock. It's an example of procedural generation done wrong. To use this system, it has to be incorporated into the gameplay loop properly. That's why it works so well in roguelikes, as it changes up the experience slightly each time to keep you on your toes. The Chalice dungeons in Bloodborne can be random, but this wasn't the selling point of the game. The game was built around its levels, combat, and story. The procedurally generated Chalice dungeons are there for those who want to play more Bloodborne, but it wasn't the selling point of the title. This is one of the big aspects used to advertise games to mass market. Remember Breath of the Wild and Skyrim? Yeah, games like this are amazing, but they pave the way for bloated crap without substance to make its way in front of consumers. Procedural generation has its uses, and it can help with developers sculpt the unique area you'll experience and remember as a player, but procedural generation, for procedural generation's sake, does not have the same level of enjoyment for gamers. After all, who's gonna stick around in a world with nothing to see but random stuff? They were so focused on this concept that their older games even have better crafting and sandbox elements. Look at Fallout 4. I guess we'll get updates in the Creation Club and DLC, right guys? Right? Alright. Let the modders do their work, it's fine.
All of this just works. It's not, I'm not kidding.
To reiterate, I don't hate Starfield or No Man's Sky, but I believe it's an important conversation for consumers to think about. Because where's the line? When do we stop accepting mediocrity? When are you gonna vote with your wallet and actually show these companies that you're tired of them being lazy? When are we gonna get tired of the skins, the battle passes, the pay for convenience and AAA pay titles, or games with a monthly sub? Games that went from releasing as the full package with DLC or extra content as an afterthought, to now this being part of the monetization plan from the get-go. show, with the content either developed already or in progress before the game is even out. Hell, Bethesda found a way to rope people into being okay with paid mods. When are we just gonna turn our games into Wizard 101 where every new area is locked behind a paywall after you're $70, $80, $90, or $100? Games might be getting more expensive due to the scale, but if the quality isn't up to par, it's not worth your hard-earned money, honestly. Diablo 4 had an awful post-launch experience for most of its player base, and it persisted into Season 1. Why did they start to turn things around? Because the player base dropped off and decided to stop playing collectively. Consumers are the power. You have the ability to bend these companies to your will as a collective group. Instead of banding together against mediocrity or shady decisions, we decide to get tribalistic and support games that only see us as a number and a bag of money, and for what? If you think battle passes and skins are the end of it, I can't wait to see us in 5 years where you have to pay an extra $70 for the other half of the game, or the content that matters. People let the WoW token slide, horse armor, creation club, DLC is already a thing that exists. Yeah, but at what point do the companies just put down the facade of live service and decide to just sell you a half-baked game in 1 year and the rest in a few months? Procedural generation has its uses, but it should never be used as a cop-out for the actual interesting content in the games we buy. Technology doesn't develop at a linear rate. It's exponential, and it's only a matter of time before AI-generated games are upon us. Heck, people are using AI to serve as chatbots, which is a game in itself. You might be asking though, well, can an AI replace the need for a development team and certain positions at the company? After doing some research, I stumbled upon this awesome video by YouTuber and game developer Callum Upton, which does a good job of showcasing just what is possible with AI and how eventually you'd be able to have an alternative to hiring a specialist for such things, such as story writing, concept design, and potentially down the line with 3D models or animations. I don't want to summarize this whole video, so go check it out if you're curious. It was a pretty good and interesting video overall. What was showcased there though is just tests done by one person. Who's to say in a few years we won't have individual creators with ideas, creating games that completely change how we know them today and what will fly for a decent or good game? I'd argue that there is a good reason to be concerned about AI generated games and other forms of content in the future, but at the same time, considering the short attention span of humans as things like TikTok and other social media platforms continue to increase in popularity, and they change our perspective on things, I wouldn't say this eliminates the need for real developers or companies as a whole. For starters, as people with differing amounts of responsibility, there's no way we'd be able to play every single game that gets generated or put out. You could argue that gaming just gets bigger every year, so there will always be an influx of more and more games being created. Gaming is a very lucrative opportunity for companies, so of course they'd want to get their hands in the money pot. Look at Elon streaming Diablo 4 on Twitter, being the biggest ad we've had so far. Mark Zuckerberg changed his brand to Meta, and now he's hoping to pull people into that virtual space. It's just going to keep continuing as we progress. The list will continue to expand of people looking to get involved, whether it's consumers, investors, companies, entrepreneurs. It only adds to the wants of the consumer versus the variety being pumped out from corporations. Good companies that have proven track records of solid games and make the world's players love, for the most part, will still trump those of AI generated universes and games, because we as humans form connections through the games we play. Whether it's making friends, posting about it on community forums, watching content, reading articles or interviews from the minds of the studios we support, and this is always going to be valued above just a great game. Look at World of Warcraft. There are newer MMOs being released all the time with better visuals, arguably better combat, depending on what you're looking for, soundtracks, etc. But yet they still remains the #1 MMO in today's era because of nostalgia and what fans remember as the good old days. Nostalgia is one hell of a drug, but a good product is timeless. After all, comics are constantly getting new renditions of our favorite superheroes. Being around since 1842 with the US publication of Rudolf Taffer's work, The Adventures of Mr. Obadiah Oldbuck. The same could be said with gaming, and it's not gonna go anywhere. Without taking the morbid approach of AI destroying humanity once it deems itself the superior being, let's talk about what good AI generated content or games can do for the industry. For starters, it serves as more competition for developers to either match or get pushed out of the industry. Competition will always be a good thing for the consumer, as all it does is gives us more options to decide where we'll spend our money. This forces developers to either adjust their approach to what products they try to push on us, monetization plans, and the quality of their work. Of course, a new developer in the industry using AI tools or not will still need to have a great vision for their game and what makes a game fun and who they're trying to target. We're fickle beings, but it doesn't mean we're gonna break old habits and suddenly switch up to what an upstart considers a great game. Aside from just gaming gaming in general, it could be used to improve things that consumers or developers are bothered by and have trouble fixing themselves. Are the textures looking extremely outdated for your game? Is the lighting not looking realistic enough? Well, with AI upscaling issues like this can be fixed for no additional cost on the user's end. You can bet companies will try to monopolize this approach through and charge you a fair premium for things of this nature once it becomes popular. The first example of this we'll most likely see is in the leaked Oblivion remaster, whenever that gets announced, as early leaks have said it will use Unreal Engine 5 for the graphics, but keep the game engine what it was originally with the codename Project Alter. Things like this are exciting and interesting uses of technology as we get further and further along. In fact, it doesn't just end there. What if I told you that artificial intelligence is now being used to read off quests and previously non-voice dialogue with relatively high quality voice acting?
This is the add-on VoiceOver Classic.
The human lands are threatened from without, and so many of our forces have been marshaled
The
abroad.
possibilities to improve existing games or even future titles is massive and exciting to see what the future has in store for us. At the end of the day, gaming is just a business, and as a business, of course, they want to take the most optimal way possible while minimizing their expenses. This may work in some instances, and the grand scale of said games or a premise is so enticing that we'd be interested in it anyway, but it doesn't always pay off to go bigger. Monetization can only get more and more egregious as time goes on. Prices get higher, society gets greedier. Not every company is all bad or trying to pinch you for your pennies, but it feels harder to get excited for AAA games or anything advertising an expansive open world as the years goes on. Remember folks, bigger number may equal better person in Diablo, but bigger galaxy didn't equal better exploration for Starfield. Be wary of marketing and vote with your wallet, not your time. Procedural generation, in my opinion, can't replace real content, whether that's handcrafted quests, characters, locations, or adventures. And like all tools, it's not what you use, but how you use it. Currently, it's not being used to the egregious extent in something like Starfield for most developers, but if you think companies won't look at the success Bethesda and Xbox have had, gaining 10 million players in a short amount of time, you'd be deluding yourself. As consumers, it's important to put your bias aside for a second and be objective when we give our opinions on games or any product so we can get the best possible result. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the video.